I'd like to welcome UAlbany English professor Wendy Roberts.
Oh.
She's a scholar of early American literature and the author of Awakening Verse, the Poetics of Early American Evangelicalism 2020, which received the 2022 Early American Literature Book Award. She received wide attention in 2023 for rediscovering the earliest known full-length elegy by Phillis Wheatley while conducting research at an archive in Philadelphia. It's not often that 18th century poetry grabs headlines in the national press.
So very true.
That's an achievement that deserves loud applause.
Absolutely.
Please welcome Wendy Roberts.
I'm going to stay here. Can you hear me? Thank you for that. Wow, thank you so much for coming out to celebrate Phillis Wheatley, her life and her legacy. I'm extremely excited for our conversation today. But I want to, before I get to the introductions for our esteemed guest, I want to first introduce the poet and start with her own words that enable us to remember her today and reflect on her poetry and her legacy. And to do that, I just want to read the first stanza of Wheatley's poem On Recollection from her Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, which is her book that was published 250 years ago in 1773. And in this stanza, like she normally does, she invites the muses to remember the past. In this particular one, the muse of memory, to enable a moral reckoning. Nimi, begin. Inspire, ye sacred nine, your venturous Afric in her great design. Nimi, immortal power, I trace thy spring. Assist my strains while I thy glories sing, the acts of long departed years by thee recovered in due order ranged we see. Thy power, the long forgotten calls from night that sweetly plays before the fancy's sight. If you liked that, I invite you to read more of Phillis Wheatley Peters. That's just the first stanza. So let me just say a few words to set the general biography of Phillis Wheatley before we move into our discussion and I introduce our guests. Phillis Wheatley Peters is one of the most important poets in early American literature and considered by many to be the mother of African American literature. For those of you who don't know her, as a young child, she may have flourished with her family in the largely Muslim Senegambia region of Africa, where she would have been taught to write and read Arabic. But as is typical of the violence of the Atlantic slave trade, certainty about her early life's exact geographic locations is elusive. One of more than 12 million African persons trafficked to America during the slave trade, she endured the horrors of Middle Passage and was sold in Boston to the enslavers John and Susanna Wheatley. They renamed her Phillis after that ship that the late poet later wrote she survived only by divine mercy. In the wake of this trauma, she nevertheless quickly acquired English, established friendships with the diasporic Black community in and beyond Boston, engaged and influenced a transatlantic evangelical culture and a transatlantic abolition movement, participated in defining the meaning of the American Revolution and its ideals, contributed to theological developments in Christianity, nurtured Black creative communities, and cultivated a network of supporters to ensure the publication of her book, the first published book of poems by an African American that we know of. She leveraged her success to gain freedom from the Wheatleys, and she married the free man John Peters, who, even after her untimely death in 1784, sought, though unsuccessfully, to have her second book of poems published. In addition to her published book, she also circulated her work widely in broadside, newspaper, and manuscript. She achieved international fame as a poet and abolitionist by age 18 and left a literary and political legacy that is still being fully recovered. Though literary critics and creative writers once argued about her literary merits, these arguments have been superseded by work that details Wheatley's complex and nuanced aesthetics and politics. And today, I'm very lucky to introduce to you two of the foremost scholars in Wheatley's studies and early Black lives to help us understand her work and significant contributions. We have with us today David Waldstreicher, who's Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His biography, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, which you can pick up today if you don't already have it, won the Francis Parkman Prize of the Society of American Historians, the George Washington Book Prize, and the James Bradford Prize for Best Biography awarded by the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. He's the author of Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification, Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution, and In the Midst of Perpetual Feats, The Making of American Nationalism. That's not enough. He's as an editor. His books also include the Library of America edition of the Diaries of John Quincy Adams, and he has forthcoming volume of Adams' speeches and writings. You might have also seen his writing in the Boston Review, the Atlantic, and the New York Times Book Review. I just want to say, on a personal note, I came across Dr. Waldstreicher's work in graduate school. He was the first historian of the American Revolution that I knew of who took literature seriously and understood that poetry, especially in the 18th century, was an active force in the world. The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley is truly a gift not only to the general public and people who haven't heard of Wheatley, but also to Wheatley's studies, because it joins a deep expertise in the American Revolution, not just to explain and give context to Wheatley, but to move her to the center and change how historians might view this period. As he eloquently ends his book, her American Revolution happened. It is also still being fought. The odyssey of her life and her afterlives converge in her prophecy that notwithstanding the modern Egyptians, there is a love of freedom. It spreads by simile. Its victories may yet be won. And I can't wait to hear more from David Waldstreicher. We also have with us today Dr. Cassander L. Smith. Dr. Smith is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the Honors College and a professor of English at the University of Alabama. Both her teaching and research focus on representations of Black Africans in early Atlantic literature, emphasizing the racial, cultural ideologies that helped shape English encounters with the early Americas and helped shape the literature produced about those encounters. Her first book was Black Africans in the British Imagination, and recently, and here at the back if you would like to take a look at it, Race and Respectability in an early Black Atlantic. She's co-edited several volumes, and I'll just mention one that's focused on pedagogy and race, titled Teaching with Tension, Race, Resistance, and Reality in the Classroom. And her current work in progress includes a monograph tentatively titled Wasteful Bodies, Conservation, Preservation, and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which examines the discourses of sustainability shaping the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th to 18th centuries. Dr. Smith is affiliated with the English Department's Huston Strode Program in Renaissance Studies, the Department of Gender and Race Studies, and Somerset Center for the Study of the South. And I want to add as well that she's the editor of a recent historic special issue on Wheatley in the flagship journal, Early American Literature, of which now she is also the co-editor. Dr. Smith has been central to redirecting the field of Wheatley studies. The capaciousness of her scholarship cannot be understated. She reaches hundreds of years before Wheatley and contextualizes her within a longer history of the Black Atlantic. And at the same time, she brings her hundreds of years forward by engaging the long history of struggle against white supremacist structures, including tracing the coping strategy of respectability. I promise I will not be talking this much. Give me one more minute to just quickly introduce my honors college class who have been studying Wheatley Peters this semester. So they've taken the lead to make this event the most meaningful event possible for them. It was difficult. They started with 10 questions apiece, and they had to hone those down just to one.
Wow.
We know that some of the questions that they will ask will assume a bit of knowledge that we don't expect everyone in the audience to have. So I invite our panelists to both answer the students' questions, but also when you do, to step back to provide a larger context that many in the audience will also want to hear. And I'd also invite either of you, if the question's directed just at you, Dr. Smith, feel free to jump in at the end and give your say as well. And at the end, we will save time for audience questions. All right, Sarah, I know you don't want it to be you, but you're going to be the first person to ask a question.
We'll turn this on.
Yes.
Sorry, I thought you were going to ask a couple on your own.
Hello, my name is Sarah and I'm a freshman here at UAlbany working towards a degree in early childhood education. As I work towards my final paper on Wheatley, I've been thinking a lot about which side of the conflict Phillis Wheatley chose or was forced to choose during her time in America and Britain, and also how this impacted her poetry and political views. Professor Waldstreicher, can you please expand on this?
First thing I want to say before I forget, and is that hearing a little bit about the course that Wendy is teaching this term, and is reminded me of my favorite course as an undergraduate, which was also a one-author course at the University of Virginia on Mark Twain, and was maybe one of the first times that my two majors, English and history, really came together, and I was able to think about writers and politics and cultural contexts, and left a big impact on me. And I one of my retirement projects is to read Mark Twain all over again. And still, I don't get to teach it now, so I'm glad to hear that there are still courses like that and occasions like this to reflect on it. But I also can't help but reflect on the fact that it would have been unimaginable for there to have been a whole course on Phillis Wheatley at the University of Virginia in the late 80s, which was only about 16 years after the school itself integrated in 1970. So at a moment when we may be doubting whether progress is possible, maybe it's a good thing for us to think about. But okay, like what I usually talk about, the American Revolution and Wheatley. Wheatley chooses the Patriots, and Vin Coretta has implied in some of his essays, and in a more tempered way in his biography, that maybe that wasn't such a good choice. Maybe that didn't work out so well. Maybe she would have been better off going with the British, which was, after all, where there was more patronage and more power, and maybe more sympathy for anti-slavery and for Africans. I think the more interesting thing is how long she hedges her bets and keeps her options open, and really plays the Patriots and the Tories against each other. And she does have to make a choice because she is in Boston and where the war begins. And but I think that especially her letter to Obor Tanner suggests that she's not ideological about the revolution in the way that we usually assume that Patriots and Tories were. That she's remains critical of both sides and presuming that she will very carefully have to weigh what she says about it, and she's a famous public person. And so I think it's actually her writing enthusiastic poems that try to about the revolution and about George Washington that try to push in one direction, but her also being quite aware that like maybe all the virtue is not on one side or the other. I think that tells us something about her whole career and also the very open-ended possibilities of the revolution, and that nobody knows what the revolution is going to mean for Africans, and nobody knows even in 1776 and 1777 and beyond what it's going to mean for Africans in Boston or elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So it's a great question, and it really I think it shows us just how much is at stake and how careful she's being, and how well she's managing all these options for remarkably long, in what is a long political process that we call the American Revolution, but is really the whole era.
Do you have the microphone still?
Did you want to choose the student next?
Yes.
I don't know if you had a certain order you wanted to go in.
So Crystal has a question about the patron and the poem.
Good afternoon. My name is Crystal Cooper. I'm a freshman here with a major in criminal justice and a minor in forensics. As I work on my final paper, I continue to incorporate and focus on the poem To Maecenas. Both Dr. Smith and Professor Waldstreicher have made use of this poem in their books, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley and Race and Respectability in the Early Black Atlantic. There are a few lines in this poem that stand out to me the most, and I will read those following lines. Not you, my friend, these plaintive strains become, not you, whose bosom is the muse's home. When they from towering Helicon retire, they fan in you the bright immortal fire, but I, less happy, cannot raise the song. The faltering music dies upon my tongue. The vocabulary and imagery Wheatley brings to this poem is why the poem stood out to me the most amongst others. Two questions I would like to ask both Dr. Smith and Professor Waldstreicher. Could you say this poem is a writing that stood out to you the most amongst others? And could you connect or relate personally to anything Phillis Wheatley Peters writes in this poem?
Nice. Thank you for that question. Tell me your name again. Crystal, yeah. So that's probably one of my most favorite poems in the volume, which is why I decided to address it in the book. And part of why it's one of my favorites is that it is in a lot of ways like so clearly subversive. And I like how she's kind of calling out the hypocrisy of the moment. And I think that's one of the things that David like really gets at in your book, right? About how you have this community of African Americans, living in colonial New England at this revolutionary moment at the time when like the language of slavery, like this rhetoric about slavery is being used by white colonists to justify, why they are revolting. And then you have this figure like Phillis Wheatley. She's writing this poem. She is essentially kind of calling out the exclusive nature, like how race is working in the colonial period, and calling out the fact that like she's being left out of something that she should be included in. And I think like one of the slickest moments for me is the reference to Seneca. Like the lines that you referenced are nice too, but like in the reference to this like classical poet who was enslaved, who she reminds us all was also from Africa, because this person wrote such amazing poetry, like that poetry freed him, it liberated him, and in a lot of ways, she's anticipating the movement that happens for her, where in the wake of her publishing her one and only volume of poetry, in a lot of ways, publishing this poetry, showing this kind of what's termed a genius in her period, is one of the things that leads to her own kind of liberation and freedom. So for me, it's this really nice, subversive critique, and then a kind of parallel movement between her and this classical poet. So I think that addresses your question. It's one of my favorite poems too, I should just say. So I don't necessarily know that I identify in particular with what Wheatley's talking about in the poem. I just really appreciate the strategies for protest. So if anything, that's what I can identify with, the push to protest. Yeah.
I love this question. Okay, I love this question. And I love this poem, which is the first one in her book. Mm-hmm. And helped me realize that how artful a performance the book and how she organizes the poems are. For a long time, Wheatley scholars were very troubled about who is this Maecenas. Am I pronouncing it right? See, I didn't have a classical education, so I never know. I'm always afraid of these moments.
I'm going to look it up every time.
Okay.
Maecenas.
Maecenas. Okay, so who is this guy?
We know who you're talking about.
Who is her patron that she's writing to in this very complimentary way, where she says, "Oh, you know how to do. You've written poetry. You are part of this great tradition, and I'm just I'm just a novice." Is what she's saying in the part of it that you quoted, and that seems to be the message, all the way through, and so there was a lot of speculation about who she's really writing to as her patron. Who is Maecenas a metaphor for? Is it Susanna Wheatley, her enslaver, who does encourage her and helps her get published? Is it some other mentor who we don't know? Maybe Mather Byles, who was a poet in Boston, and who it could have been a bunch of other people. I ended up realizing pretty late in the game of my research that it's actually this guy, Lord Lyttelton, who was an aristocratic patron of poets in England, and who she actually tells us in a letter that she visited, and who was particularly interested in these servant poets, these basically working class people who were discovered by aristocrats and then published. And this was a kind of a popular thing to do in the mid 18th century. And it was missed by a lot of scholars because Wheatley does go to see him, and then he dies suddenly a few weeks later. But in one of these poems that's written in the newspaper about him, they actually refer to him as Maecenas because people had written, it was a joke. 20 years before this, it's a joke that he's known as the modern Maecenas, because Maecenas was this Latin aristocrat who was Horace and Virgil's patron. So this is like an old trope, and everyone who's so when she writes a to Maecenas poem to start her book, she's basically saying, I've read all this stuff. I'm in this culture. But it's also a performance of saying, accept me, and the reason you should accept me is because I've read all this stuff and I can make all these classical references, which now we read it and don't make any sense unless you read the footnotes. And even then, usually, you don't get that much help from the scholars because we think that this is just sort of window dressing, but to her it's not. She's actually showing how much she has is able to riff off of Homer and Virgil, Maro, and then it goes on, and then she sets it all up, and she's going through the history of Greek and Roman poetry, and then she gets to Terence, the African poet, saying how. But say ye muses, why this partial grace to one alone of Afric's sable race, from age to age transmitting thus his name, with the first glory in the rolls of fame, and then she has a footnote, he was African by birth, saying, okay, maybe actually Africa is closer to Greece and Rome. She's pointing out that that North Africa was actually part of this Mediterranean world. Maybe it's not weird for me to be writing poetry in this tradition. Maybe it's weirder for you people from this far away Anglo place. So she's sort of throwing it on the table that she can own this tradition and be part of it, and that these gestures of saying, I'm not worthy, or I'm just a novice, I'm a young poet, that's actually what every single poet had to do to demonstrate, to imitate the poets and refer to them. She is showing that she can do it and setting up her even more ambitious poems that come later in the volume, and that she's going to live up to this reputation that she's been publishing. She's already getting famous, that people have already heard of her, and answering any criticisms that people might have that say that, that an enslaved person, an African, can't possibly write accomplished English poetry. So, and when I discovered that she was talking about Lord Lyttelton, and that Lord Lyttelton had encouraged poets and had written this kind of poetry and was friends with Alexander Pope, I'm realizing there are even more layers to the way she's setting up her being the next hot thing in English poetry than we had realized. Yeah. So so I get very excited when about this poem, even now, because and also, as I was talking with Wendy about over coffee before I came here, I had this experience when I was researching this book. I got into it and thought I had something to contribute about Wheatley because, as Wendy said, I'm a historian of the American Revolution, and I've written about slavery and anti-slavery. But as part of my process of trying to read everything that Wheatley would have read, I started to read these Greek and Roman poets like Homer and Virgil, and which I hadn't done because I hadn't had that. Even though I was an English major, I hadn't had that kind of classical education. I read Milton, but I didn't read the poets that Milton was responding to and riffing off of, the Greek and Roman ones. And by that time, in the late 80s, when there was this big battle going on about the canon, the people who were championing Greek and Roman writers were saying, oh, you should read them and not Toni Morrison. And I knew which side I was on, even as an English major who was reading Milton and Pope. As well as modernists, and so I was like, that's the whitest male of whitest male literature, and I started to read this stuff in translation, of course, and it's like women and enslaved people are all over this world that Homer and Virgil are writing about, and Horace, and all these poets that Wheatley refers to, voyages and people being enslaved and liberated, and I began to realize that she could have seen herself in this, particularly in those writers that she's actually referring to Mycenaeus, and that's part of what she's saying, I think, to readers at this time, that that this isn't a foreign world to me, and that I had, and that so I got to have what I came to think of as a Wheatley-like experience, reading that literature and realizing that it wasn't as foreign to me as a specialist in early American studies, and with kind of maybe Anglophile sensibilities, as well as an interest in African American studies that actually wasn't. And so the great irony is that I had to get into Wheatley to learn how to appreciate the classics, and that's nice. I think that is a gift she has given me that will always be with me.
Yeah, we'll put that on this billboard. Yeah, if you want to appreciate the classics, read Wheatley.
Nice.
Is there a student next on your
list,
Wendy?
Yes. So Katie has a question about Tanner and other poets.
Hello, my name is Katie Anna Gallagher. I'm a double major in history and English studies. I'm currently in my sophomore year. And as I work on my final paper on Wheatley, I'm thinking about Wheatley's relationship with other women, especially Aubrey Tanner, who I believe is the only known enslaved woman with who she corresponded with. So, as both of you know, history frames Wheatley as an exceptional figure in American history, but from her letters with Aubrey Tanner, we are made aware of another educated black enslaved woman. So what do the panelists think about the likelihood of other possible Phillis Wheatleys
during the American Revolutionary era whose poems we have yet to find or became lost to time?
Absolutely.
Or was Phillis Wheatley truly exceptional and had a special non-imitable talent? And also, do the panelists think Arbor Channer could have been a poet or some kind of artist or writer alongside Wheatley?
Nice. Yes. I love these questions about like community. Yeah. So like maybe like the short answer like for me is both and in terms of her exceptionalism, like whether she's exceptional or representative, I think she's both. And when I think about Phillis Wheatley, I think about what was possible in the colonial period. So like if you had this one person, comes over enslaved, she's taught to read and write in English, like there are others, right, who had that same kind of capacity. So in that way, to me, she shows what's possible. And not just, like we also do have archival evidence that there were other literate Black folks in not just colonial New England, but throughout the time period, right? She wasn't the first person to write verse. She wasn't the first Black woman to write verse, right? If you know the example of Lucy Terry Prince, who comes along in the 1740s, which is I think she composes a ballad in like 1746, which is about 15 years before Wheatley comes to Boston. Hers is, with Lucy Terry Prince, hers isn't published until the 19th century, so it's circulated more by word of mouth, so that may be one difference between Wheatley and Lucy Terry Prince. One of the things for me that makes Phillis Wheatley phenomenal or exceptional is just the way that she's able, it's just what she's able to do with her poetry. Like she becomes mobile, she's traveling, across seas, she goes over to London. She's moving around in these circles with all of these big name influential people on both sides of the Atlantic. Again, she's not the only Black person who's doing that even, but the way she's leveraging her poetry to gain access to these different communities, I think is remarkable. But again, I do want to point out and emphasize that if we're thinking about Wheatley's cultural contribution, it can be greatly nuanced if we put her in conversation with what was a larger community of Black women who also were, if not writing, they were participating in different kinds of literary activity. So in addition to Lucy Terry Prince, particularly in the realm of religion, you had Black women who were narrating conversion narratives even before Wheatley. Like two really prominent examples happened in the 1740s and 1760s. Again, right before Wheatley arrives in Boston, you have these two Black women who are composing narratives of their experiences converting to Christianity. And in these narratives, they're basically, giving their life stories. They are essentially, life writing. They are types of autobiographies. And what's important is that they kind of show us how Black women in particular in the 18th century were leveraging religion and Christianity as a way to gain cultural visibility, because these narratives were very public events, and they're also kind of they are articulating a sense of personhood that we don't typically think about, because when we think about this period in Black women, we think about them being enslaved and being beyond the realm of personhood. So all of that to say that your question is a really important one, because it asks us to really think in more nuanced ways about what Phillis Wheatley's actual significance is. And in order for us to do that, we have to understand that she wasn't just exceptional as the, quote, first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in English. She was in a lot of ways also representative of the ways that Black women in that time period were, trying to narrate their lives and, show their visibility in the culture.
All right, can I, just as we're running out of time, I want to ask Angel. You also have a question about letters and Tanner.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about Uwe Tanner. Say a lot.
Hello, my name is Angel Jackson, and I'm a human development major and a freshman. So as I work toward my final paper on Wheatley, I'm thinking about examining the role that friendship and sisterhood played in Phillis Wheatley's experience as not only an enslaved person, but as an inspiring published poet. So one relationship I plan on specifically taking a look at is Abdur Tanner with the help of Wheatley's letters that she wrote to her. One thing I found myself thinking about several times this semester is different ways in which Wheatley addresses others in her letters. Dr. Smith, my question is about one of Wheatley's great poems on being brought from Africa to America, which overviews faith and salvation. How do you view her attitude towards faith in this poem, particularly in terms of tone and language, and how that played a role in Wheatley's life in New England and her writings? Phillis Wheatley practiced a Christian faith, and at the time she closely considered Abdur Tanner, another enslaved woman like Wheatley, her friend, and they bonded over their relationship with God and kept each other on the right path.
Yeah, I tell you, that poem has been pretty vexing for Wheatley scholars over the decades, right? So this is a poem on being brought from Africa to America. It's like, 8 lines long, and then like the first pair of couplets, she is seemingly, like, if you read the poem with the grain, she's seemingly praising the fact that, like, she's been captured and brought out of Africa and is enslaved in the U.S., right? Because it affords her the opportunity to be converted and become Christian, right? And then the second half of the poem, it kind of does this turn where it says, hey, for all of you white Christians, remember that even black folks, black as Cain, can be refined, and they are Christian too. And so your question is like, what do I make of the language and the tone in that poem? And then what might this say about, or put that in conversation with how she addresses Abdur Tanner in her letters, right? Like in terms of the kind of sisterhood that they're creating. This is one, like, so I like the poem to Maecenas just as a poem. I like teaching on being brought from Africa. Like, that's my most favorite poem to teach. First of all, it's nice and short. It's 8 lines, right? So students will read it. It has a nice rhythm, like the flow of it is very clear. And it's also a really, 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 really great poem for teaching students, like in literature classes, for teaching students how to read critically, because it's so clear how you can read the poem either taking it at face value, which is to say, like, you take what she says, like, you believe that she's sincere in every single word, and you get one meaning, one idea about who Phillis Wheatley is from it. But then you can also read it against the grain, where you doubt every single thing she's saying about how she represents Africa, about how she represents her conversion to Christianity. And if you read it against the grain, you get a completely different impression of Phillis Wheatley. What I like to do with this poem is just to remind students, this is one of those poems that really speaks to her humanity. A lot of times in Wheatley studies, we want to fall into this trap where we think about her in these very stark terms, where either she is an assimilationist, right? So she has come over to America, she's converted to Christianity, like she's just drinking the Kool-Aid, right? She's like, I'm so glad you brought me out of that pagan land, thank you. Right, now I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I can remind you that I'm a Christian, so you need to treat me as a Christian. Or they read her as woefully subversive, so like she's this kind of trickster figure where she's saying in the first half of the poem what her white readers are expecting her to say, like, I'm oh so grateful, only to then kind of turn the script in the second half of the poem to criticize them for the hypocrisy of religion, right? But the problem with thinking about Wheatley in those kind of stark terms is that, like, human beings aren't really like that. Like, we are all by nature very contradictory, complex individuals, and we don't ever think all of one thing or all of another thing, right? So on Being Brought from Africa to America is one of those poems that just kind of reminds me, like, I don't know what to make of Wheatley's in terms of the tone and language in the poem. So that's the short answer to your question. I don't know. what I think about the language and the tone, but I appreciate the not knowing because it reminds me of just how complex and complicated Phillis Wheatley was in her thinking. Maybe there is some part of this poem where she is absolutely wholly sincere. Maybe there is some part where she's being where she's being critical, where she's protesting, right? It can be all of this. Maybe she herself had complex feelings about her capture and her conversion. And I just think that this poem kind of calls a lot of that into question. And how this relates to her relationship with Uber Tanner, I'm going to say the same thing. Like, the difference for me is that, like, with these poems, like, she understood that this was going to be read. Like, this was public, right? With the letters, when she is advertising for her second volume, she is including some letters, right, that she wants to publish. So in some ways, there is this kind of letter writing tradition that is performative for Phillis Wheatley. Like, in other words, she knows or she anticipates that some of the letters she's writing will be read by other people, right? So it's not a wholly intimate exchange. I don't know, and you may know more, or either of you may know more about the process of writing specifically to Uber Tanner, whether it was a wholly intimate act. I'm just not sure because, and if we did know more about whether she anticipated some of it being public or not, can kind of tell us whether the letters were the same kind of performative as the poems were. And so I can't quite make up my mind one way or the other. What I do think is interesting is that what we have so far in the archive is 7 letters so far, right? And they are all letters that are from Wheatley to Tanner. We don't have any letters from Tanner back to Wheatley. So that tells you that one of these people was actively saving the letters. The other person, maybe not, right? So it makes me wonder, like, when Wheatley got letters from Uber Tanner, what the heck did she do with those letters, right? But then if you think about Uber, like the fact that she's holding on to these letters and she's passing them on to other people to be preserved, tells us that she anticipated some value in holding on to these letters for posterity. What we can make of that, I don't know.
Wow. I guess the thing I would add to that, which was so wonderful, is that Wheatley always knows who her audience is. And some of the differences of tone between the letters to Uber Tanner and letters she writes to other people are quite striking. And I think that's also true of all the poems, and one of the things about that poem, and this whole book comes out of the experience of teaching that poem, and having students respond to it in the classroom differently, and thinking about what that meant, is that I love the reading that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I also think that, like all great artists or all great art, it, intentionally or not, can be read differently by different people, and that it succeeds in part because of that. That also made it dangerous. And this is one of the poems where we can say that it wasn't probably written, there's no manuscript. It only exists in her 1773 book. So, but there is, when she dates, it is referred to earlier by a similar title, and suggesting that it was written 5 or 6 years before. But there's no manuscript, and that suggests to me that, like, it was potentially dangerous the way it might get read, or it might be read differently by different people. She may have kept revising it. She may have been not sure if she wanted to publish it, or maybe the book was safe enough to publish it, but it wasn't. She may have passed it around like other manuscript poems. Maybe she didn't. And I like to think of it as a good example of how poetry was very much popular culture, as well as high culture, as well as great art at the time. And it's not clear what she would like in that poem, in which she's talking so much about herself.
is this like a calling card? Is this a response to critics? Who is the audience for that poem? And the way she drops it in the minute, like after she's already shown how virtuous she is and how knowledgeable she is about poetry, the way she drops it in there as the fourth or fifth poem in the volume.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also need to read it in that context, and that it's a performance of her ability to be very concise, but it's also written with an awareness that different readings might be valid and that it's going to be read differently, and that some people are going to reread it as, oh, she's completely not threatening, and other people are going to read it as the gauntlet in the face of racism, like throwing the presumptions of white readers in their faces. That I think is also, that I've argued is true, or is a completely valid reading. But that the other reading, in some ways we could say more traditional reading, is also valid, and people have always read it that way. And if you focus on the first couple of lines, or you take it more literally, that I think we have to sit with the fact that, like, she may be consciously and unconsciously intending it to be read in more than one way, and that maybe is part of what makes it great art. And the comparison I sometimes I like to make, and it's especially important vis-a-vis poetry and difficulty, is that, like, the function that poetry had then is the function that popular music has for us now. And it's not an accident that that's the one place where we accept that rhyming is not only okay, but accepted. And if you think about, like, some of the, like, more artful lyric writers today who you listen to this song for years and then you realize what it's really about, or you're a different person years later and a different part of it speaks to you and you have a different relationship to it. That's what's going on here. That's what's going on. That's what Wheatley is doing again and again, and especially in some of the more direct ways in which, when she's speaking directly to us and less elusively in a poem like that.
I'm going to ask Zayla. You might be the last student before I open it up to the general audience.
Hello, my name is Zayla Brinson, and I am an English and Psychology double major in my sophomore year here at UAlbany. In your introduction to race and respectability in an early Black Atlantic, Dr. Smith, you comment on how some scholars have not looked favorably upon and even criticized Phillis Wheatley's work due to it displaying a supposed assimilation into the broader culture of 18th century New England. Given this, was it difficult to begin reading the work of Phillis Wheatley through the respectability lens after such prevalent condemnation? Were there moments you had to pause and reevaluate your thinking? If so, how did these moments of reflection inspire or propel you in writing your book?
Oh, okay. Ooh, okay. And I think I'm actually going to go back to something that we were talking about when Crystal was asking the question about how I might identify with Wheatley and her poem To Miss Sinus. And so I'm going to answer your question by saying the criticism never bothered me, because, I mean, like, I encountered Wheatley when I was in grade school. And, I mean, it was a time, I mean, in grade school, you don't get a lot of examples of Black women writers, particularly in the early period. So, like, I had no clue what scholars were saying about anything. All I knew was that this was a Black woman who was enslaved, and she had written a poem, and I thought it was so cool that she had written this poem way, way, way back many, many, many years ago, when all Black people did was just be slaves, right? Like, she challenged so many ideas and misconceptions, some of which I had been taught. And so I was thankfully not privy at all to any of that. So I didn't come to Wheatley with that kind of baggage. I came with the other kind of baggage. And so for me, she was a really, really useful figure for helping me to ask different kinds of questions about early America and about the role of Black people in early America, particularly in the culture. So in that way, it wasn't difficult at all. The challenge for me with writing a book about respectability politics in this early period was actually, and this is something that Wendy was talking about at the very beginning, about how like I'm always conscious of, in thinking about these early figures, also wanting to think like presentists, and I know that's a bad thing to say, like for historians, the presentism, but I can't resist the urge, right? And like I myself am very much caught in the throes of respectability politics. So what was difficult, like I felt this huge sense of conviction as I was writing the book, as I was studying, these figures like Phillis Wheatley, because on the one hand, it's clear to me how they are challenging and problematizing these ideas that if you just assimilate and act like white folks, and that will inoculate you from racism. But at the same time, living in this moment and knowing that that's just not true, right? But still yet, subscribing to a lot of the tenets of it, right? Like the way I dress, the way I talk, the way I think about education as the great equalizer. And so it was always this really, really difficult kind of push and pull for me to really appreciate the magnitude of what I was uncovering and thinking about as I was kind of, reading between the lines of Phillis Wheatley's work and being in this kind of current moment in, 2022, 2023 when I was writing the book. So that was a challenge.
Want to open up to general audience questions?
Yeah, let's do that. And if no one jumps in, then I've got two students
Does
in the
anyone
wings.
not in Wendy's class?
Yeah.
Have a question they'd like to ask? Yep.
Thank you. Greetings. So I teach here in the Writing and Critical Inquiry program, and thinking about Phillis Wheatley. So here's this black woman in the 18th century writing, right, and doing all of the things that you're saying that she's doing, and being subversive and claiming her own space, etc. What can we learn from that now? How can we take Wheatley and move forward? How can we use her as an example of how to build futures for us all?
Nice. You're going to start, David. You look like it's right on the tip of your tongue.
I think I'd rather think. I'd be very happy if I got to think for a little bit. So you can please go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, how can we use Wheatley today? For me, a lot of it goes back to, one of the things that we've been saying here is just about an example of what's possible. And there's so much about Phillis Wheatley's life. And I don't know, like we keep saying Phillis Wheatley. Should we acknowledge the Peters part, like Phillis Wheatley Peters? Or
I did at the beginning.
I just think that like one thing that we can learn is just like about strategies for speaking truth to power. Yeah. I mean, like, again, David was just talking about how her poem on being brought from Africa to America can be read on these multiple registers. One thing she shows us is that, like, black folks have always had a way of being able to communicate, they've had strategies for being heard, for cutting through all of the hypocrisy of politics. And for me, like, she's just a reminder, and she's also a reminder of how long we've been doing this. And also, one of the things David talked about at the very beginning of this hour was about progress and thinking about progress and whether we've made progress. And for me, thinking about Phillis Wheatley from 1773 to where we are in 2024, there's progress, right? Progress is not linear, right? You're going to take some steps back. But the progress is still there. So, for example, 30, 40 years ago, you could have an entire class on Mark Twain, but maybe an entire class on Phillis Wheatley was inconceivable. I don't think that's the case now. I think like in 2024, you could have a class on Phillis Wheatley and have her at the center of it. One of the things, I am the co-editor for Early American Literature, which is, the main journal for the study of early American literature. And in 2022, 23, when did we have the special issue? Yeah, I think 22. At the end of 2022, we had a whole entire issue that was just on Phillis Wheatley. It was the first time that the journal and in the journal's 50, 60, 70 year
history. Longer
history.
than the average issue, too.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was a big thing. Yeah, David was in the issue, and it was the first time that we had a whole entire issue that was just focused on this Black woman poet from early America. So progress is a thing. So for me, the thing to learn is strategies for speaking truth to power and for just staying the course and knowing that progress is a thing. It's not always linear. Even when you think you're moving back, you will move forward if you just keep going.
Wheatley's always been a not just a great example, a prime locus for a debate about strategies in Black American politics and culture. And even in the sort of responses to my book, I've seen, it's interesting to see reviewers and folks just kind of emphasize the tragic aspects of her life versus other people emphasizing the positive and the amazing and heroic things that she managed to accomplish. And I always come back to that line of hers from her manuscript poem, America, sometimes by simile of victories won. I love it so much because it both makes the biggest possible claim for the importance of words in public and also says sometimes, and doesn't tell us what victory means. It could be small victories, it could be revolution. So I think she had a very realistic sense of the political work that language and culture does, and also a very realistic sense of its limits and the fact that it might go backwards and that we don't know the effects of our words and we can't predict them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a profound understanding about the relationship between literature and politics and between everyday political action and change and historical change. And that's why I keep coming back. I also love it because the term simile, which is a kind of a fancy term for, it's like metaphor, right? It's a comparison without using like or as opposed to metaphor, which just does it without saying this is like that, but just puts the image that compares forward. Simile, the 18th century literary critics and poets, some had this battle over whether Homer was barbaric because his similes were barbaric. So basically, there was this idea that the ancients were really good at similes, and whether that was a good thing or not. So in saying that I'm all about similes, there's another way in which she was claiming to be in the tradition and to be doing the same thing that all the great British writers were doing. Just by naming simile and saying I'm going to talk about simile, I'm going to enter this conversation about whether similes are good or bad, or and how to use them. She was performing this very thing that she's talking about, which is there's a political revolution might be going on. We're trying to advance a conversation about slavery and about race, and we might be doing it very carefully through simile, and that might be very kind of careful and respectable. But on the other hand, this might be the only way to do it. This might have radical effects. So, is respectability politics the only thing that works, or is respectability politics too polite? That's what she's dealing with, as Cassander says so well in her recent book.
Wendy, you were trying to find a specific page. Did you want to end with something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know we're out of time. If you'll indulge me, I will end with just a few lines from another Wheatley poem. This is to SM, a young African painter, on seeing his works, and I think it speaks to the last question about futures, because Wheatley talks a lot about imagination and bringing creation into being, and she looks up at what might be. So let me just read a few lines to close. So she's speaking to another artist, Black artist, on seeing his works. To show the laboring bosom's deep intent and thought in living characters to paint. When first thy pencil did those beauties give, and breathing figures learnt from thee to live, how did those prospects give my soul delight, a new creation rushing on my sight? And I'll skip down. She asks, on what seraphic pinions shall we move and view the landscapes in the realms above?
Thank you, everyone, for coming.